I like that I picked the same color palette for everything, like my awala, my room, my princess hat. This is a letter opener, by the way. It's not dangerous. It's not lethal. So when I made up my mind to do a project on Lancelot and Guinevere, I was not expecting the sort of wild goose chase that comes when attempting to research Arthurian legend. So I don't think this hat is going to stay on, but I did want to show it off. Let me take it off now. She's very prettily back up on my wall. Anyway, the wild goose chase. So when people think of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, they probably think about the Holy Grail, the sword in the stone, or the famous affair between Lancelot and Guinevere, which is what we're talking about today. But between all of that mystique and mystery that spans years of literary remixes and revisions, at the very heart of Arthurian legend is remix of an original that we can't even pinpoint, really. Hello, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Kelsey, and today I'm actually doing something a little different from my normal book videos. This is both a final for a class and also an attempt to introduce this kind of literary commentary to my channel. I really love literary analysis, so consider this my first foray into more researched sit down and talk videos. Unless you're my media teacher, who will please consider this a final. Also, if you keep seeing me look down, I have a script, so I don't not say the right thing. So since my childhood, I've been pretty obsessed with fantasy and Arthurian legend and medieval studies in general. I think most American kids growing up around my time and even now are very familiar with King Arthur, most primarily through Disney's Sword in the Stone or BBC's Merlin, which I haven't actually watched yet, but I will. I promise I will. But King Arthur is kind of really responsible, and the surrounding myths are very responsible for a lot of the fantasy tropes within fantasy media in general. So it would be very hard to even engage with fantasy at all without running into a reference. But even the full story is only pieced together through variations in different authors' stories across time. Things being written about today about King Arthur, like new retellings or things like that, and new stories about his knights, honestly have as much capital in the lore, because there is no one lore to rule them all. Everything is canon because nothing is canon. So mentions of a related King Arthur begin as early as 830 CE, Common Era. Note that I said related because we have no idea if King Arthur was real or imagined or a mix of both. At this time, it was pretty common to just make up historic figures. Think Shakespeare. So in 1830 CE, Welsh historian Nennius mentions Arthur as a soldier at the Battle of Badon Hill, which was a historic victory for the Britons over the Anglo-Saxons. I'm not getting into history lessons today. Just know Britons over Anglo-Saxons, and that's why Britain today. Importantly, accounts of the battle closer to the actual time it took place do not account for a King Arthur or an important Arthur at all. Nennius kind of says that King Arthur killed most of the opposing force. I think he said 800 to 900, which I don't think is possible. But I don't know, I wasn't there. So now that we're going to get into more of the mythic stories, I just wanted to point out that he has been mentioned in history. We're going to start with perhaps the most important writer or well-known Arthurian writer, Chrétien de Troyes, who is obviously French, and he's living and writing around 1130 to 1190. He's the author of 5 stories making up the basis for Arthurian legend. He introduces the quest for the Holy Grail, Arthur's sword named Excalibur, which will become Excalibur, of course, and importantly for our discussion, Lancelot and Guinevere. I want to start by saying I'm not going to go through all the history of like King Arthur, Mordred, Morgan Le Fay, all those like other kind of asymmetrically related things. I'm only going to really be focusing on Lancelot and Guinevere because that's the basis for my project. This story about Lancelot and Guinevere is called The Knight in the Cart. The story itself depicts a young anonymous knight named Lancelot frantically traveling to save Queen Guinevere, who has been kidnapped by an evil person. There's a lot of them in these stories. He runs into a dwarf with a cart and hesitates before agreeing to ride in the cart. And it's important to note that carts at this time were sort of associated with criminality and thievery, which of course is related to Lancelot, hesitating but agreeing to engage in the crime of infidelity with Guinevere. So during the battle between Lancelot and the evil lord who kidnapped Guinevere, Guinevere is very upset that Lancelot sort of hesitated to get on the cart. He placed his own honor and how others might see him above his devotion to her. So, to win Guinevere back, Lancelot agrees to lose against sort of inferior opponents in a tournament until Guinevere tells him to win. At last he wins, and the two embrace. After he rescues Guinevere, the two develop a sort of mutual attachment. Not yet a desire, but an interest, dare I say. Lancelot dedicates his life to serving King Arthur, and the two develop an intense brotherhood. The conflict between duty, friendship, and love creates tension in the story, as Lancelot is left to juggle his loyalty to King Arthur and his budding feelings for Queen Guinevere. Lancelot in the Cart also gives us the basis for perhaps one of the best movies ever, in my opinion, and it should be in everyone's opinion, A Knight's Tale, where Lancelot consents to lose multiple tournaments until Guinevere tells him to win. I love that movie. I love that movie so much. Anyway, intermittently following Detroit, many poets and writers start to flesh out the surrounding universe of Camelot that Lancelot and Guinevere reside in. The French poet Wace adds the Round Table in 1160, sort of adding, various knights to that as well. The French poet Robert de Baron adds the Wizard Merlin and the Sword and the Stone in 1190, and around 1215 to 1230, the Vulgate cycle has been produced anonymously. The Vulgate cycle is probably one of the most important literary texts for Arthurian legend, and particularly Lancelot and Guinevere, but quite annoyingly, it can't be found online. So I really had to work with what I could gather from Britannica and Wikipedia. The text was almost an anthologizing of all the works made to that point. Think about it as like a big collection of all the stories sort of that people at this time are considering canon. This text also evolves the Lancelot and Guinevere relationship into courtly love, which at the time in medieval literary conception of love, it sort of emphasized nobility and chivalry with the idea that the game of love and pursuing love on its own was an enriching practice. And that's kind of where you hear the saying like love for love's sake, which of course is what Lancelot and Guinevere are doing, because they shouldn't be doing that. But they're loving for love's sake. And it's courtly. Next, Sir Thomas Malory expands on the relationship in Le Morte d'Arthur, which is probably also what most people are familiar with. Almost exactly 300 years later. So around 1469 or 1470. So in this story, the affair excels beyond courtly love and becomes adultery. And Malory writes, "So to pass upon this tale, Sir Lancelot went unto bed with the queen," which went onto bed. I think they went under the bed, if you know what I'm saying. Right. So true. Malory also introduces the affair being discovered by King Arthur and Sir Mordred, who's like evil, leading King Arthur to wage war against Lancelot, allowing Mordred to seize the throne of Camelot. Mallory's story also ends with Guinevere running away to a nunnery and Lancelot becoming a monk. Cool. So finally, Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem Guinevere, published in 1885 and sort of also considered canon. Like I said, anything ever written about it has as much leeway in the lore because there is no one lore. Anyway, this poem finds Lancelot and Guinevere after the war, and in Tennyson's version, Guinevere is sort of overcome by guilt and begs the forgiveness of King Arthur. And Arthur, in turn, becomes sort of a speaking voice for the modest Victorian society by condemning Guinevere and placing most of the blame on her. As a sidebar, I cannot overstate how emblematic of Victorian English society it was at this time, which sort of began to, I don't want to say like create, more so revive the idea of like fallen women and seductresses and, you know, being of the devil women. Sort of like a long list of literature backing up this, I guess, fear of men being afraid that their wives are going to cheat on them, or, you know, holy men being seduced by succubi. But I digress. In the end, Guinevere dies, and Lancelot, as a monk, performs her last rites, and then dies himself too of grief. So this, to the best of archival knowledge, is the plot of Lancelot and Guinevere's affair. They meet after Lancelot rescues her, they begin this sort of courtly love situation, which is found out by King Arthur, and, you know, they go to war. Lancelot and Guinevere both exit their respective sides of the stage, so to say, to live lives as very regretful religious people, and then die. Great. So, of course, many contemporary authors and authors throughout history have sort of done their own spin on this tale, with romantic and feminist remixes abound. But what I love most about King Arthur and sort of stories like these that don't have a set sort of rule to follow is the element of play that other creatives get to have with it. There is sort of like a small amount of what we consider canon lore, but the very essence of Camelot is to remix and revise and play with the elements. In this, there is no canon that critics can critique new iterations against, and it particularly allows newer writers to just create a puppet play with sets of characters with their own personalities. Even though I only really trace the tale of Lancelot and Guinevere, there are so many knights and characters for people to play with and learn about that there is never a dull day in Camelot. I think this is why I always find myself returning to stories like King Arthur or even Robin Hood, which also doesn't have sort of a set lore. Because, you know, every work of fantasy that you engage with now is at least, in some small part, influenced by Arthurian legend. It would be impossible to engage with fantasy without finding, you know, the quest for a MacGuffin item, the quest of a fellowship, magical women in lakes, and mischievous wizards. In this, one is never far from Camelot. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this very brief history of King Arthur. This was a really fun project to kind of research, and it really allowed me to really do a lot more literary research than I think I've ever had to do in my entire life, because like I said, you really have to dig through websites and strange PDFs and academic sites to find genuinely anything about these people, which is strange because I feel like Lancelot and Guinevere, that's like, they're kind of big namers, but you know, that's just me. And I also really liked getting to research something that I've really enjoyed since childhood and has been like a really big impact on my life and the stories that I really like. I feel like I'm really drawn to kind of epic romances and epic fantasy, probably in no small part because I watched A Knight's Tale and Ever After and Sword in the Stone when I was very young. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope I'll see you next time. All right? Bye bye. Goodbye. Good morrow, fair friends. Ciao.